Good evening, dear fellow alumni. Welcome to the 46th edition of the AIM AI Fame webinar. Today's topic, State of Inclusive Finance, Agri and Microfinance in India, key to India's $5 trillion GDP. It's a very relevant and interesting topic in today's trying times. To expound on this, we have amidst us Dr. Alok Mishra, MDM 2001, CEO of Microfinance Institution Network, and who was instrumental in setting up India's first commodity exchange, NCDEX. The facilitator of this session will be our AI and AI Honorary Secretary and my fellow MBM 98 batchmate and dear friend Darshan Ganguly. Without further ado, Darshan, all yours.
Hi, evening everybody, and hope you guys have had a nice Christmas long weekend. Hi, Professor Purva Rao. So, Alokji, I think you spent a very illustrious 30 years in developmental finance and seen it all the cycles, all the ups and downs. So it will be very nice if you can share how this development finance space has evolved over the last couple of decades, and the whole concept of financial inclusion, which is supported by policy, how that is being built out by various governments and the bureaucracy as well as the private sector. So it will be, I leave the floor open to you now.
Yeah. So thank you for having me today on the panel. It's a very topic which is very dear to my heart, and so you have your first question is what should I say, a very vast gamut of how it has evolved and all that, but still I will try to do justice to it in the time limit which we have. So if you see that, we say that if you talk to many persons, they will say that financial inclusion, access to finance, this has become very important after 1990s or 2000. It's a recent phenomenon, they would say. But I would beg to differ because the Indian policy planner since 1950s, it was at the fulcrum of development policy in India. And if I have to say that even pre-independence, steps were taken to what you can say, start accelerate the flow of credit to the needed sectors. And if you see the evolution of development finance, which is basically rural finance, but it also includes now urban finance, because we say that poor and marginalized persons who are away from formal sector also in urban. That's a recent phenomenon. But the focus on rural finance has been there since times, I think, since early 20th century. And if I have to divide it into three, I would divide it into three phases. The first phase, I would say, is 1904 to pre-independence, that is 1950. And that was the period in 1904 when the cooperatives were set up by the Britishers to finance agriculture. And that system went on till 1950s through various changes and top things, and establishment of Reserve Bank of India. And to our credit, you would say that the Reserve Bank of India, since its inception, is the only central bank in the world which has also incorporated development finance as part of its agenda since the inception. Generally, central banks are the monetary authority of the country and regulatory authority. But here in India, Reserve Bank of India, right from the start, was having development finance as part of its agenda. So 1904 to 1950 was the primary period of cooperatives. Then the second period, I would say 50 to 69, you can say, was left for cooperatives to perform by our development policy planners and the government. They said that cooperatives will finance the rural part of it, and commercial banks will take care of the urban and industrial and corporate part of it. However, when it was found to be not happening, we all know the second and the most ambitious phase started from 1969. That is with nationalization of banks. And 1969 to 91 is a very important phase in India. It's the financial inclusion or banking experiment history. World over, you would not have seen such sweeping changes in the formal financial structures as you would see in starting from 69. And what were the elements? Nationalization of banks, setting up of targets, concept of priority sector lending, that you lend to certain sectors of a certain balance sheet size, differential interest rate subsidies, directed programs, and specialized institutions. Later on in the 70s, while all these things were going on, late 70s, the government also started working with, what you say, setting up specialized institutions. The first set was regional rural banks, which were set to be sort of a, you can say, mini commercial banks operating at a regional and a sub-regional level. And they would said to be that they would have, the classic example given is that they will combine the financial resources of commercial banks, but the touch and feel of the rural population. And that experiment started in 79. And within 5-6 years, we had 170 or 160 RRBs in the country. We are very fond of numbers, so we immediately scaled up to 170. And in 1982, NABARD was formed. NABARD was formed, and to give a focused attention to agriculture and rural finance. And when NABARD was formed, NABARD has been carved out of two departments of Reserve Bank of India: ACD, Agriculture Credit Department, and ARDC, Agriculture Refinance and Development Corporation. So when NABARD was formed, the entire rural finance part of it came to NABARD. Like IDBI got separated from Reserve Bank of India for industrial finance. So up to 91, so many experiments and everything happened. And from 91, if you look at the All India Debt and Investment Survey of 90s, it reset a thinking that despite all these reforms, so much of policy push, specialized institutions, things are not happening to the desired level. The reforms were initiated in 91. Though the causative factor of reforms were different, that was our macroeconomic instability and foreign exchange reserves, but still it was extended to the banking sector also. And since 91 till now, we are in a set of financial sector reforms. And what has been the piece of financial sector reforms in the initial years? First, it was that the financial inclusion piece of the small value ticket size loans and financial services was left to the microfinance part of it. By that time, you see, coincidentally, when our reforms happened, the Grameen model had succeeded and microcredit was being experimented in India. Though, and there is another misconception that microcredit started from Bangladesh, and that is the main reason. But Indians had started much earlier in form of self-help groups. That's a different story. I will come to it later. So it was left to it. But by 2010 and 2008 to 10, another tectonic shift has happened, that the government has again started pushing commercial banks into financial inclusion by way of various financial inclusion programs, FIP1, FIP2, FIP3, whereby the idea is that you must have one banking outlet, whether it is by a BC, banking correspondent, not having a brick and mortar branch, or an ATM for a population even up to less than 2000, you should have one branch. So that is the state we are in. So currently, after going through a very heavily state-induced, what you can say, policy thrust till 91, then in between Delhi, what you can say is experimenting with microfinance piece of it, and now a mix and match of it, both private and public getting into it. So this is the stage we are into it. And as we speak, we also have to assess what has happened. In 70 years, we have done so many experiments, so many bold things. So I would say the gains have been impressive because in 1951, when we became independent, only 8% or 9% people as per AIDS used to get formal credit from formal institutions. But now that percentage has gone up to 65%. But at the same time, there are huge challenges. And if you permit me, because I think if you have second question, we can go to that. But if you say that because finance, agriculture and all that with the farm laws, agitation and all that is a big thing, there are various things which have emerged in agriculture. In a few nutshell, I would like to speak. But if you have a follow-up question to what I've spoken till now, you can ask it now.
Yeah, so, though the government has been working very heavily on the policy side, making changes our way on the regulatory side, but we still see pockets of excellence, so to say. One, there is over servicing in some of the states, and there are states that don't have any servicing.
Yes.
Similarly, it seems to be the government only believes that only people who have land need to be serviced. the person who doesn't have land, which is the either the labor or a marginalized farmer, or even people who are working in the forest areas, especially Adivasis and others
Yeah.
in the tribal areas,
Yes.
they still continue to be underserved. So, what are your thoughts? How can the private sector get involved in that piece of the action?
True.
Because I think the 35% that we are talking about is really not easy to catch.
True.
And it's also an educational issue. It's probably even going forward an issue of whether the telecom areas reach there or not.
True. True. While the policy intent was always to, I would not agree with your statement that it was only to go for the land owning persons. Because if you see Reserve Bank policies, NABARD policy, Government of India policy, there are a lot of policies on sharecroppers, on tenant farmers, on oral lessees. So all these are there. But the problem lies in the structure which is financing them. That is the banking structure, which is not confident of going there. I will talk about it. And the second issue which you said is about regional differences in credit flow. So if you look at the financial inclusion map of India and delivery of financial services, as you rightly said, there are spatial problems, that is based on regions. There are gender issues in that. There are occupational skewness in that. So all sorts of skewness are there. But but at the same time, when we criticize it, we should also look in the backdrop of the gains we have made, from 10% to 60% formal sector. Now, coming to the part of geographical, I'd like to address the geographical thing first. Like we all say that in northeastern sector or of the country, the credit GDP ratio is very low. The banks are not financing, despite bank branches being there, and their deposits are being funneled away. Now, this is a bigger problem, which I thought I would come later on, but now that you have raised it, I must answer it. I've always said that the problem sometimes with the policy makers is that they think that banking sector is the panacea for everything. For example, even in COVID stress, if you see the COVID package, there also they say bank will lend to MSMEs, bank will lend to this, banks cannot do everything. Banking sector credit flow is only a means. In northeastern sector, if I don't have farm to market roads, if I don't have a stable electricity, if I have law and order issue, if I don't have skills, where is the bank going to finance? If the bank finances or any financial intermediary or private institution finances, that will lead to non-performing assets, and then they will be held to account that your financing was not good. So the basic, I think the policy flaw has been that you should not focus more on banks, because ultimately in financial markets, we know credit will go where it is due. You can, in a developed economy, yes, some policy prescriptions are required so that marginalized sections also get some share of the credit flow from the country, from the banking sector or the financial sector. But you cannot force the banking sector to go to a place which is not economically viable. So in that case, it is the responsibility of the public policy, to create conditions where the credit can flow. And if that does not flow, we will keep talking about it. Banking is not doing this, banking is not doing this, credit to GDP ratio is low, this is low, that is low. So that has to be solved first. For example, even in agriculture credit, when we see so much of issues, if you have declining soil fertility, poor realization of farm gate prices, and poor risk mitigation mechanism, irrigation to what level is falling, in that context, banking credit will only lead to subsistence farming.
So, do you really believe that before this amount of credit can be pushed into the system,
Yes,
it's very important to build out the developmental parameters, be it skills,
true.
be it entrepreneurial
Yes,
ability, so that you can at least set up the self-help groups at that level. And most importantly, once they produce something, the ability to be able to market. So for the farm produce, whether it's farm to fork or for small artisans to be able
true.
to bring it to the market. So I think the entire opening out of retail, opening out of various platforms in terms of the markets I think that's very important. The policy making there and in a way influencing the private sector to work in priority areas to build out and bring those products to their markets or to their shops. I think
True.
it's very important to build that out before you push the credit.
because
So,
because see, building markets, building soil, improving soil level, soil quality, then markets, infrastructure, these are long gestation products and which may not be financially viable but economically viable. And as you know, private sector is not going to finance economically viable project. They are not looking at EIR, they are looking at FIRR. So that heavy lifting government has to do. That is the role of the government. Once you create that, then the crowd-in factor will be there from the private sector. And when you talked about the shying away of private sector, while these issues are there and the market is crowded in by public sector banks, there are a few other issues also which have cropped in because our major focus has been on agri-finance. And agriculture finance in India is currently roughly annually of the order of 14 lakh crores, which is a huge sum of money it goes in. But still we see what is the condition of farming and why it is so. That is a very pertinent question we need to ask. And I just wanted to, if you permit me, I will just wanted to show you. I have written some few points. I just wanted to show you, or I can speak also, whatever
no,
you
no,
wish.
please share the slide if it's ready. We
Okay,
can very
the
happy to.
slide is ready. I will just show you the slide. Okay, let me show you the slide. Let me go up. Yeah, I think everybody can see it. Yeah. So if you see it, I say that any developmental intervention of such a large scale which has been carried out, you have to see that it can be assessed on three fronts, which I say. One is efficiency, second is inclusiveness, and third is sustainability. Now, as you were saying, you can see when I look at efficiency, in agriculture finance, generally we will measure the adequacy of finance by a ratio what we call as credit to input requirement. That if suppose for growing X number of crops in the country, you need Y amount of funding, then how much has the credit supported it, which we call as credit in simply credit to input requirement. So credit to input requirement in India from 91 when it was at 20% after doubling of agri credit has gone up to 130%, which shows that input requirement are 100 only, but there is an excess financing happening up to 130%. But that's not the story. The real story is in states like Kerala, states like Punjab, in states, some other states, it has gone up to as high as 340%. So where is that money going? And in some states, it is as low as 24%. Some states is 34%. That brings to your perspective data to your question of geographical thing. So what is this happening? And when this is happening at the same time, why private sector does not enter the market in these cases? That all the agri financing, especially the short-term financing is what for rearing of crop loans, and investment is for buying of a tractor or improving of the land and all that. The short-term financing is done through Kisan Credit Card, a credit card system in India nowadays, and it comes at a very low rate because if you promptly repay with the interest subvention of the central government, it is 7%, and in many states the state governments top it up. So ultimately, if you are a good repair, you will get it at 2%. So a plausible reason has been given by eminent persons that because of these low rates, many persons sowing their land, they will borrow, but they will not use it for cultivation, but rather they will use it for on lending, or they will deposit it in some bank and get 7%, 8% on fixed deposit rate, and finally they have to pay only 2% out of interest subvention. So all this type of policy, when it tries to become overarching, it
It's
deters.
become an arbitrage product
It has become an
rather than
arbitrage
a
product.
credit product.
It has become an arbitrage product. So this on the efficiency side of it. Then on the inclusiveness part of it, a large scale survey was carried out by NABARD in 2017, which is National Financial Inclusion, Rural Financial Inclusion Survey, short form is NAFIS. It said that in last year in agriculture households in India, 43.5% only borrowed. And out of 43.5, only 60% were only from institutional sources. Some had borrowed from both institutional and non-institutional, and some had borrowed only from non-institutional. So if I multiply 60% of 43%, how much it comes to? It comes to around 25%. So that means only 25% of farmers or agriculture households borrow from the country. At the same time, the data, we have to see that how much of what sort of fluid data we live in. We have roughly around 150 million farmers in the country. And as per the official records, around 70 million KCCs, Kisan credit cards have been issued. So at least 50% should have been covered. And on this side, your survey says that only 25% are borrowed only from institutional sources. So there are some discrepancies. And if you go down the tail to small farmer and marginal farmers, which is owning land less than 2 hectares, and they own almost 85% of the total land area is occupied by them. They are 85% of the farmers are small farmer and marginal farmer. So they have an unequal share in credit flow. And finally, the biggest thing which affects the flow of private capital to it is the politics of loan waiver. The last national scale loan waiver happened in 2008-9 under UPA. After that, what we have seen is the central government has held firm, not having a loan waiver, but there are various state level loan waivers. Maharashtra had, Madhya Pradesh had, for so many states, 6 or 7 states had. And that leads to a moral hazard issue. With the one hand, you are distorting the market by interest subvention. On the other, you are announcing loan waiver. It gives rise to NPAs. Currently, banking sectors, agriculture credit NPAs are 10%, and it distorts the market. So, in this condition, it is difficult for private capital to flow in full speed in rural finance. And just to show you one more thing, that is on the left side of your screen is the land holdings of farmers, and you can see that 85% is roughly by farmers below 2 hectares, which I said. And this is what empirical data from NAFIS, which I said. 60% borrowed only from institutional sources, 32 from both institutional and non-institutional, and 9 only non-institutional. Yeah. So these are
For every farmer
yeah.
who's available in this data point, how many non-farmers would be there? That's labor or people who are not even in this but part of the census of India.
No, you are talking about the NAFIS survey?
Yes.
No, NAFIS survey, I am presenting you only the picture of agriculture households. They have also covered non-agriculture households also, casual labor and wage labor. That's a different story.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
And
on your earlier slide, I just had a comment to make. So
yeah.
if the government is now thinking about putting out these farm land health cards and farm land digitization, will that data point then allow the government to actually think through and even the banks to think through where this credit is going in? Because you just can't have 300% credit being provided on input goods.
True. Yes, that is one step. See the digitization of land records, the geo mapping of cropping patterns, what crops you are growing. Because I will give you an example. In India, the financing happens by, suppose I say I have 2 hectares of land and I go paddy. At each regional level or district level, there is a scale of finance decided that for cultivating paddy in 1 hectare, you need 5,000 rupees. Now I can, in connivance with the local officer, I can always say that instead of paddy, I grow chili, because chili is a higher scale of finance. So but actually I will grow paddy only. And that is why once when I was in NABARD in 1998, I discovered in one district in Andhra Pradesh, the amount of chili which was grown was more than half the size of Andhra Pradesh. And that was only in one district. So those things happen. So what, as you rightly said, digitization of land records, geo mapping of what crops are being grown, these are a step in that direction. And along with that, government has to realize that it is amply proven through various studies, empirical studies and all that, that interest rate 9% or 11%, that doesn't make a difference to the farmer or to any person. Microfinance has proved it. What proves it that you should give it timely, you should give it adequately. If I need 70,000 rupees, you give me 70,000 and give me hassle free. maybe in 2 or 3 days. Instead of that, if you give me 40,000 after 45 days of circling around your office, that is of no use. But some or the other, our public policy is fixated on interest rates. We continue to set triers about interest rate. This is high, that is high, and that is what distorts the market. Darshan, I think you're frozen. Yeah.
Now is it better?
Yeah.
I was frozen for a while.
And one more thing I wanted to say to you, that we have come to a situation where 45% of our cropping is only rice, wheat, and sugarcane, and of which rice and sugarcane are very water guzzling crops, and we continue to farm that, and it is almost 50% of it. And the other big problem in agriculture finance is that in over a country, after 70 years, only 48% of our land has got irrigated. And in some cases, like in Punjab, it is almost 95%. In some cases, like Maharashtra, it is as low as 19%. So with 19% irrigation and growing water-intensive crops, you are looking at disasters, and that is what is happening in many parts.
I think a combination of over irrigation and massive use of fertilizer over the years
Yes.
probably degenerated the soil conditions
Yes.
and also made the rest of the areas having drought forever, because we are just diverting the water for the crops that the politicians want.
Because our
That's basically what's happening.
because our
This whole
fertilizer
cooperative business, both offshore and
because
other areas, has actually hurt the other subsistence farmers.
because see, the soil needs a combination of NPK, but our policy has been fixated on urea, and so you will see in the soil excessive use of N, and P and K are absent because they are costly fertilizers and they have to be decontrolled fertilizers. They are difficult to obtain, costly. So people will be putting urea as a substitute, but N can't substitute P and K in soil balance, and that is what leads to problem. So you have problem of low irrigation, you have problem of unsuitable crops, you have problem of inadequate credit, you have problem of missing of extension machinery, and so on. So, Madhav, there is n number of problems to talk about.
Yeah, and interestingly, my wife's classmate in Assam, he's been doing micro irrigation projects, but he's not able to get credit. He's literally set up a trust and he's taking donations and delivering it, because there doesn't seem to be a credit for that. So I think we can just move on to microfinance. We covered our ground on the broader piece, but I'd really like to understand how you believe microfinance has built out the inclusive India. It's seen its two cycles of being uh, the poster boy, and then there were so many draconian laws that came in, and the government was really afraid of microfinance. And now again, it seems to be on even keel and trying to guide not just microfinance but even the banks into microfinance. So, I wanted to hear from you on that piece.
Yeah. So when we talked about inclusive finance, we see, if I break down, India's working population is roughly 500 million. And I have extrapolated this data from census of 2011. And if you see, around 140 million are engaged in farming. MSME is 120 million, roughly around that figure. Agriculture labor is 100 million. Others is 140. And I have kept out, which will be a very marginal figure, of wage earners in blue collar jobs like you and me. That I have kept. So in that 500 million, if you see, and so we have to see where microfinance is relevant and why it is growing. So if you look into it, you see farming is a cropping season based financing, where microfinance cannot enter, and it requires in capital intensive farming. So microfinance can only be a substitute wherever there is underfinancing part of it. So I leave 140. Microfinance is very relevant for the others 140, which are engaged in maybe a vegetable vendor or Our country is now become, or a pakoda seller or whatever you call them, street vendors. So they need credit to scale up their business, sustain their livelihood. They are 140 million. Agriculture labor. Why agriculture labor? Because agriculture labor, not all will be doing labor because they have to balance their meager incomes with multiple livelihoods. So they need some other livelihoods, whether it is non-farm sector livelihood, and they need credit. And in MSME piece also, out of 120 million those who are employed, you know that 95% are micro and small enterprises. And out of that, even 90% are proprietorship firms, very small, tiny enterprises. They are not typical SMEs of what we talk in the literature of IFCs and World Bank, but they would, I would say, rather veering towards KVIC sort of tiny enterprises. So 140 plus 120, even if I take 100 out of it, 240 plus agriculture labor, if I take around 350 million people, uh, roughly in India, require some sort of access to finance which the formal banking system is not able to provide. And that is where microfinance steps in. It does two things. One, sorry, not two things. I would say four basic things. One, that it gives credit at a very fast turnaround if you are eligible, and if you pass all the due diligence checks and the credit bureau records are fine, it gives you credit within practically within a day. The money hits your bank account. One. Two, it is collateral free. Three, it is collected and delivered at your doorstep. It is delivered in your banking account, and collections now have not become very digital, still happen at center meetings at branch, but the person goes there. So it's a doorstep last mile banking. So a combination of all these things has made microfinance popular. So quick turnaround time, adequate credit, doorstep banking, and no collateral, and minimal paperwork, which is a direct thing. Now, so people say that, Mother, we can come to it later on. The cost of credit question is there, that microfinance is at higher rate than banking credit and all that. That will we can address that later on. But in this 350 million, microfinance is important, and that is what shows to its growth. Because originally, if you see, look, before 2010, I could say, when you talked about Draconian Act, you are talking about the AP State Government Act. And when we talk right now, the Assam state government is trying to do something like that, which we are trying to dissuade them from. Uh, but up to 2010, only microfinance institutions, which have now become NBFCs, NBFC MFIs is a separate category, they were the sole players in the segment. But now, if you see, banks are there, small finance banks are there, and mainstream NBFCs like you are also there. Like L&Ts and the Fullertons of the world are also there. And on talking about the contribution made by microfinance, I would show you the next slide, and you can see that I have just put a graph here. You can see it in the total portfolio of the sector, and it was, and if you see March 2012, it is the gray bar is there, which represents in the legend only NBFC MFIs. As I said, it was only NBFC MFIs. The sector was only 16,813 crores. And as we speak today, in September figures, it's 2,31,000 crores. So how much humongous growth it has happened. And if you see the legend now, the NBFC MFIs now have come to only 70,000 crores, or they account only for 30%. The major players are now the banks, 94,355 crores. Then small finance banks, which were earlier MFIs only, they have become small finance bank. They are 43,000 crores. So 2,31,000 crores. That's not a mean sum, which is the loan outstanding as on date. And the other thing, the outreach, because these loans are small. So the outreach factor is also to be seen. On the outreach, if you see, at currently the sector reaches 6 crore unique borrowers. So 6 crore unique borrowers is 60 million. And each borrower, if I take a normal household size of 5 persons, if I multiply 60 into 5, 300 million it becomes. So 300 million population is being touched by microfinance in India today. And out of our total population of 1,200 million, so almost 30% is being touched by microfinance sector. That has been the growth story. And the great testimony of its success is that so many players are entering into it. And despite all the doomsday's prognosis that this is not going to work, this is not going to work, it has worked. It has worked the country. It has reached 6 crore beneficiaries as of date, and 6 crore is not a small amount. And recently we did a study by National Council of Applied Economic Research. It is in final stages. We will be releasing it in January. It shows that microfinance in India in total contributes to 4% to the GDP of the country. And while doing that, we have used an input-output model, not a very direct derivation, but that is what the approximate measure we could do. So 4% of country's GDP is contributed through microfinance services, lending with a loan outstanding of 2,31,000. And this is only one part of it. This is private sector MFI, you can say, model. But there is also the government's self-help group model, which you can add is another 1 lakh crores or something like that. So this is about the scale, the appeal, and the contribution made by microfinance.
Sure. It also gets me thinking, like
Yeah.
Grameen has already moved to micro housing finance.
Yeah.
So are we also doing micro housing finance as part of this? Because, you know, the issue that I always watch in the credit system is that I'm worried that it should not just go for personal loans. So they can even put out the loans for micro housing, and the affordable housing piece also comes to the fore. We'll be able to really reach out and get housing also under our belt.
Okay. Now, when you talk about micro housing loans, you know that in India, our regulator is very keen about micro regulation. So the macro is one part of it, their story, but they are very keen on micro regulation.
I know
also.
they've kind of differentiated NHB versus all the others. I'm aware of that.
No, because if they get into a business of microfinance institution and say that you can lend, because as you know, people would not know that in India the RBI stipulates that you can lend to a borrower with an annual household income of 1,20,000 or 1,60,000 in rural areas, with an annual household income of 2 lakh rupees in urban areas. Your loan total indebtedness should not increase 1 lakh. So, or you should not lend more than 50,000. You should get it repaid in 1 year. With so much of regulation and short-term financing, how can micro housing product be launched? Because if micro housing you have to do, it's a long-term product. At least the repayment cycle has to be 5 years. But the regulations don't allow for it. The
more like 15 years, I think.
No, in rural areas, even 5 years, because it's a small amount that works. But that wing is being taken out by separate micro housing companies, as you all very well know. So microfinance getting into that, I see the present regulation, it doesn't seem like that. Because Grameen Bank is a full-fledged bank. It has got access to retail deposits and it can do whatever it likes. But in India, microfinance institutions don't have access to retail deposits. They have to depend on large-scale debt funding from banks and equity infusion from the private equity investors. That's the model. So while equity is long-term, but equity is only 20% of your balance sheet, 80% comes from debt, and debt is from banks, and that is short-term, 1 year or 2 years. Within that, to do a micro housing and that to get it repaid within 2 years, it is not possible. So regulation acts as a barrier.
Yeah, so I think I've covered most of the questions. Just wanted to have your thoughts, the last thoughts on what do you think can change, and give the next flip to India in microfinance.
Okay. So I thought that this question will come. So I have I think I have put one or two bullets here. One is I have said that getting the framework right. Now that the sector has matured, it serves so much. It had demonstrated its resilience. It had demonstrated its utility. It's time to move to an asset class based regulation for the central bank. When I say asset class based regulation, now microfinance is done by banks, small finance banks, mainstream NBFCs, as well as MFIs. But while one set, which accounts only for 30%, is under a very tighter piece of regulation, the others are going through a normal process. For example, a microfinance institution will lend at 20% with a cost of fund of 14%. A bank with a cost of fund of 7% lends at 26%. So this is the irony which has happened. So we say that you have to move towards an asset class based regulation. Second is, as I said earlier in my opening remark, the regulator has to move from micro business regulation. You don't manage the business to which you cannot manage. Like if you say that I cannot give loan to a person which rural person which is annual household income of more than 1,50,000, people are going to take a declaration. But is there any means you are going to verify that whether that household earns 1,70,000 or 1,50,000? Why do you put in place rules which only lead to destruction of trees and papers? That is what. So they have to move towards customer protection, focus on consumer protection rather than on business regulation. Then thirdly, I think for the potential for private sector to flow, capital to flow, for full blooming of the sector, interest rate fixation has to go. What poor people need is reasonable credit, adequate, timely. That is the main thing. Then in policy and implementation, there has to be channel neutrality. You cannot be, our regulator is very focused on banks. For banks, banks for them is holy. Everything else is seen with a tinge of suspicion. NBFC, they might be profiteering. Banks are the holy cows. So that aspect has to go. There has to be channel neutrality, and past committees of Reserve Bank only have said that, like Nachiket More Committee of 2014, that the regulation has to go to channel neutrality. And finally, I think another aspect which is which people ignore is that the ability of the regulator to move and deal with modularization of financial services. Na? Earlier, when I say, I must a little bit explain it, because earlier what used to have, suppose I am running a bank, I will design the product, I will market it, I will service it. Now, under fintech models, every piece is being segregated and sold to different pieces. Somebody designs, somebody sells, somebody services. So there are various regulatory challenges. It overlaps various regulatory boundaries, and that regulation has to be very fluid-footed. So that old style regulation will not work. And fourth, and sorry, not fourth, the last point is that when you talk about interest rates, the interest rates, yes, it can be lowered, but you have to get some domestic patient capital into it also. The public sector also has to put capital into it. If you want private equity to fund it, a private equity wants typically 17 to 20% return per annum. So you have to give that. If you want to replace that, why don't you provide liberal capital to microfinance institutions at with a return expectation of 7 or 8% through NABARD or through SIDBI or something else? If you don't do anything but still keep crying about interest rates, you are neither serving the poor nor serving the institutions. So I think if these things, these are broad things, but if these things can be done, the inclusive finance business model will be more clearer, more flourishing, and private capital will flow in, and the real financial inclusion will happen.
Thank you, sir. I think your last slide was the clincher. Right? It kind of points out to all the things that are possible and easily doable. However, given the policy framework around it and the multiplicity of agencies and regulators, it's going to be an uphill task getting it through in a short period of time.
True.
But thank you so much for this. I think we should now move to the questions very quickly. I'll continue to take the questions. So there's one from Aditya Verma. So his point is, how much of rural finance goes towards agricultural finance and how much of it goes into non-agriculture?
Okay. So it is almost, if you, in that case, I have to club non-farm sector finance as because rural finance can be defined in India in two parts: farm sector credit and non-farm sector credit. So currently it is 70-30, 70 towards farm sector, 30% towards non-farm sector.
Within that, Mohandas has asked a question: how much of agricultural loans go towards crop bearing, which is seeds, manure, and labor, and the B is towards equipment purchase?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I would say that let me. It's a very interesting question. So I will give me 1 second. I will just want to show you again one slide which I had plotted, and his question has rightly referred to it. Here, if you can look at it, at the graph, the seeds crop rearing thing is the short term, which is the blue line, and the red line is the long term credit, which is investment capital. So in India, earlier what used to happen was you can see that now the long term credit share has dipped, and the short term is almost making for around 70%, and capital investment is forming only 30%, while earlier it used to be reverse. So within agriculture credit, currently 70% goes to short term, 30% goes to long term. But there is a catch here. Some people have opined that this trend is like this because now that short-term credit goes on Kisan credit card, which is a perennially renewed credit, and on that interest subvention is there. So people keep borrowing from short-term and investing in long-term. Because if you borrow long-term credit in India, it comes at 12%. If you borrow short-term, it comes at 7%. So there is a diversion from, it may show on paper as short-term and in our graphs as short-term, but actually it might have been used for long-term. But I have another corollary. I think this graph is correct, that the capital investment in agriculture is dipping, because if you look at the other figure, which is gross capital formation in agriculture, that is also showing a declining trend. So that gives me a trend that this graph is true. So 70% is towards short term and 30% is for investment.
So there's a question from Purva Rao, Professor Purva Rao. How
Yeah.
do you decide on the interest rates? Is the rate same for all borrowers or the same asset, or is it different for different borrowers?
In case of microfinance, the rate formula is same, because Reserve Bank of India has put in place a pricing formula that you can have charge your cost of fund plus 10%. So to simplify it, there are other formulas also, but this is the primary use, cost of fund plus 10%. So in 10%, what you have to cover? You have to cover your OPEX, you have to cover your risk cost, and you have to cover your profit margin. So typically the rates are same, and the regulation also currently in Reserve, as per Reserve Bank of India, says that difference between any two loans within the permissible range cannot be more than 4%. So typically, in practice, if you see, all borrowers are lent at the same rate. And because while there can be a question of a cross subsidy and all that, but if you look at the profile of the microfinance borrowers, the their standing, their credit profile, and all that is similar. So there is not even much scope for differentiated pricing. But to answer it shortly, yes, everybody is priced at the same rate.
Question from Pramurto. He is asking, how do you see fintech impacting microfinance, specifically in a sector where most underwriting is often quite subjective or qualitative? Do you have any recent fintechs in this space that you found interesting?
Okay. Now, this is another very broad question which I would like to answer in a little bit of detail, because nowadays fintech has become the buzzword, so everybody wants to talk about fintech. Now, in case of fintech, I would say that the person who has asked the question also to look at our website MFin, and by January, I think early January, we would also be placing on our website a report on fintech in microfinance. Now, in fintech, if I see applications part of it, microfinance has already adopted much of fintech. In terms of fintech comes from home, there are different dimensions to fintech. One is core banking system in your MIS system that has been adopted. That is also sort of a fintech. Second, integrate while disbursing loans, not relying on paper formats, but loan officers of most of the microfinance companies now go to the field with their tab, wherein they fill customer detail. There is an online check on the online check with the credit bureau, where the credit eligibility is seen, whether the borrower is in default or not. That is ticked, and the eligible loan amount comes, and that is immediately transferred to the bank account of the customer. So that is fintech. Third, the disbursement happens, as I said, rightly into the bank account. While taking repayments also, we are trying to do so many experiments through QR code, through BC points, through eNAS. So that is also fintech. Now, the only area where I see fintechs can, that will be the next generation, what you can say, of microfinance, as the questioner rightly said, is that the credit assessment currently remains weak. Earlier, the microfinance, the loan officer would go and talk to the person, and they would know. 10 years back, if I would go to the field, the microfinance loan officer would know everybody. Everybody, ki, Alok Misra does this, his family has 2 members and all that. But now with volume and blind reliance on credit bureau, that skill is gone. So we need more supplemental data checks. Now, where from those data points will come from? The problem with microfinance borrowers is, other than their credit history, what sort of data points can be there? Much of the population of India, the typical microfinance customers, they live in what I call as the data dark spots. So you don't have much data. All these techniques of scraping emails and scraping social media and profiling will not work. Electricity bills, electricity in most of the rural areas is free or subsidized. Water bills is almost free. So all those, what are those data points which can be added into it? We are trying to look hard into it, and it will be good if future solutions come through integrating multiple data points into getting something else other than credit bureau also as a substitute of credit score. That is the role I think which fintechs can play.
So the next question is from Aditya Verma. In private sector, what's the challenge for consolidation to take place in the MF sector? And separately, he's also asked, how has SRO approach, such as MFIN, helped the sector?
What is the second part of the question?
How has the SRO approach, such as MFIN, helped in the sector? I don't understand what is SRO here.
SRO is the MFIN is a self-regulatory organization recognized by
Okay.
RBI. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Now the first question was the consolidation piece in private sector, I think,
That's
in
right.
microfinance. Huh? So I think this consolidation piece is a usual question which I get in investor calls. Whenever I have investor calls with Motilal Oswal or Leeladhar Prabhudas, they will talk about the the Bombay market. People are very much interested about consolidation and equity valuations. But from sector SRO point of view, I see that it is not good to have too much of consolidation. It is good to have smaller players with have a local feel. Microfinance is the last mile banking. What we call as it will always be touch and tech. It can never be only tech. So it is good to have small players there. And whenever consolidation happens in microfinance, it is almost a sort of a compulsion, because if somebody is not able to raise funding, somebody's rating has gone below, like in COVID stress, there can be some cases, then they may buy out, sell out or something like that, consolidation happens. But from a sectoral point of view, I feel more the players, better it is. There will be differentiated practices, there will be good approaches, there will be competition in market, there will be local flavors also. Now, when the second part of the question was, how does SRO see this piece, or how does SRO function? SRO has nothing to do with consolidation and all that. That's the market dynamics part of it. On SRO piece of it, we are focused on, as an SRO, our role is that we try to see that the RBI regulations are followed strictly. And secondly, on top of it, we also have an industry code of conduct, which is what you can say regulation plus. Because while RBI is what we classify is to do no harm, I would say in that category, our regulations go to do good. Means what are the best practices in that are also monitored. We'll look into how to build a customer protection mechanism, which is like, for example, grievance redressal system. We have a toll-free number across regions in India. First port of call will be to the institution. If that complaint is not resolved within 7 days, it comes to the SRO. We get it resolved within 15 days. That is one piece of it. Then the other piece of it is that we don't rely on the self-reported data. We have third-party evaluations from independent evaluators. Every month, every year, we get into the field and see, are you following the regulations and industry code of conduct or not? Third, through credit bureau data checks, every quarter we check each data set of the loans which you have distributed, and we see that whether you have violated rules or not. And finally, we also support you. Like if you want support on credit bureau, you want support on, we have set up an employee bureau, you want on support on loan officers training, that also we provide. So basically, to see that you follow regulation, and if anything impedes your capacity to do that, to bring you up to speed to that.
Any policy suggestions for influencing cropping patterns, matching crops to water availability?
Okay. So in
It's a question from Malini Shankar.
Yeah. I think the that's a very what you can say deep question, because it has always we have always said that yes, okay, people are growing rice, wheat, and sugarcane in water scarce areas. But how do you influence that? That's individual's choice and all that. I think there are various mechanisms through which it can be signal has to be given. Like in 1965, after Indo-Pakistan War, when the country wanted the farmers of Punjab and Haryana to grow wheat and rice, the policy signal was given. Like credit was given, technology was transferred free, extension machinery was set up. Now, these things, policy signals have to be gradually withdrawn and market will move. You cannot do it over a period of time. You have to give them substitute because farming is generational thing. So once you have settled a family is settled in farming wheat and paddy, it is very difficult for them tomorrow to shift to sunflower and mustard only. So that will take time, but policy tweaks can happen. For example, the way you route subsidy, that can be changed. The subsidy can be routed in some other fashion. Then other programs of the government, like for example, the NABARD operates a rural infrastructure development fund. Now, rural infrastructure development fund financing for building rural infrastructure should not be tailored into what leads to more growing of wheat and paddy in those areas. For example, if you want wheat and paddy farmers in Punjab to wean away from that, but at the same time, you are building wheat storage godowns from RIDF money in that area, what signal you are giving? So those policy signals can also be changed. And maybe setting up of market mechanism, allowing private players to procure at a higher rates and price mechanism, those things can be done. But it has to be a very gradual shift. Right now, our policy is not very coherent. While we talk about Swaminathan report and all that, we talk about moving away from those crops, but our policy continues to support because you continue to subsidize water, not subsidize, give free water. You continue to subsidize generators. You continue to subsidize wheat warehouses. Then why is the farmer going to switch away from wheat? So those signals have to be given.
Question from Mukul Venkatraman. Is there a solution to resolve the mismatch of using short-term loans for long-term use?
Yes.
So that's one question. There's a related question from my side. How do you stop the parsing the parcel? Because a lot of the financing, if I see, seems to be just refinancing the earlier financier. So are there any regulations to stop refinancing so that the buck stops there and the person actually has to pay up and have the ability to pay up?
Yes. Okay. Now, see, over a period of time, first I will answer that first question, how to stop subvention of short-term loan to long-term loan. Stop credit market subvention, what you can say intervention. Let the banks price short-term and long-term loans adequately as per the tenor risk and the interest rate to move as per tenor risk, and things will sort out. Don't do interest subvention and all that. That's a simple thing. Second question of yours, Darshan, because when the whole policy setup was made, that how you don't refinance, that is a very policy had inbuilt checks into it. We had concepts like seasonality. We had concepts like overdue cover. Like it always used to say, suppose NABARD refinances a cooperative bank finances a primary agriculture society, primary agriculture society finances a farmer. And suppose you have finance for Kharif season. So NABARD will ensure that suppose 100 rupees has been pumped into the system, at the end of the season, till 90 rupees is drawn back from the clot back from the system, new money for Rabi financing will not flow in. So it is basically checking, means it's like sucking in and again putting water into it. So that whole mechanism were there, but under Kisan credit card, that credit card sort of scheme, those disciplines have gone away. So now it is very difficult to check what is being rolled over. Maybe some sort of seasonality discipline, even in KCC. Suppose I have got a limit of 10,000 rupees. It must be seen that end of the Kharif season, at least I must bring it back to 3,000 or 2,000 rupees. Somehow 80% of repayments should come. That discipline has to be enforced. Then it can be checked that you are not rolling over the money from Kharif to Rabi, Rabi to Kharif.
Asim's question, will you expect pre-COVID levels of collections and disbursements in the sector? And second question from him is the securitization of food assets are also at a lower level. Do we expect any upside?
Okay.
and the
First,
pooled assets.
second question I could not get.
Securitization of pooled assets or
Securitization.
pooled assets. This
What does it
must be
mean?
about microfinance pooled assets.
Acha, pooled assets. I thought food assets.
Yeah,
Oh,
sell
sorry.
down. Yeah,
Okay,
sell down of debt, pooled debt.
Okay.
You're saying securitization is also at lower levels. When is the upside expected?
Okay.
Both are correlated.
Okay. So when you talk about collection efficiency, I think the sector is now reporting a collection efficiency of around 85%, which is the best in the financial asset class. I think we have been saying that even 85% is too much, seeing what COVID has done and what COVID stress has led to the farmers. Let us be empathetic to the customers and don't be after cleaning your balance sheet and showing a 95% return. That's not practical. There is stress on the ground. But the way disbursements are happening, by December, I think we are reaching almost 80 to 85% of pre-COVID level disbursements also. So in case if there is no future spike, God bless, if there is no future spike of COVID, there is no major disruption of economic activity, I think the recovery levels would touch the old levels by end of March or April. By that time, we would see normalization.
But the next quarter will be quite critical because I think most of the customers will come out of the COVID relief, so they will have to start collections.
Yes, that time the real NPA
That's
figure
a
will show.
critical quarter.
That's the real NPA because moratorium ended on August, and up to December 31, you can still restructure your loan as per RBI's resolution framework. So it still gives you 90 days. So after March finishes, in April, the real credit portfolio quality will be seen.
Given the high quality of credit at a broad level, and if there is real capital assets to be created, do you see the microfinance industry also setting up and getting approval from the RBI for peer-to-peer lending? Because I think that's a possibility for the entrepreneurs, which will, because of COVID, a lot of people have gone back to the rural areas.
But
The credit could be made available by the MFIs.
I don't think so because
Larger credits.
because RBI stance has been that P2P is a separate class and they have set up a separate class of NBFCs for P2P lending. So they are not going to mix it with this. So I think P2P has to go on with Rangde and other type of platforms only. I don't see an opportunity for microfinance there. But the last question I think which I missed was that when does he believe securitization to pick up?
Missed that answer.
Yeah. So securitization will pick up because why securitization is done? Securitization reduces the need for makes your balance sheet a little capital less intensive, and you can load off capital, less capital and more leverage you can take in through securitized assets. And now that most of the microfinance institutions will have to have for March balance sheet will have to prepare provisions for losses, and the capital will be under severe stress. I think securitization activity will pick up in Q4.
Thank you, sir, for an excellent presentation. And I think a lot of us have benefited from your vast experience and deep knowledge of the sector. And actually, practically, working right from an operational side and working with the policy makers would be really interesting combination that we will be able to do today. Thank you so much for your time. I'll just hand you over to Nikhil for the last words. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
When we had such a excellent speaker, there was a question: who should be the interviewer, who has an equal interest of asking relevant questions. So it's good, and I am happy that my batchmate Darshan Gangoli has asked the right questions and made it more interesting. And just as a bye-bye to y'all, here is me and Darshan. We sat together. He came over, and this is we were sitting like stock market, like two traders, and he was asking the questions, and we were together. Just we were batchmates and roommates. And today I said we should also be together when we are interviewing Dr. Mishra. So Dr. Mishra, thank you very much. I will unmute everybody because people would like to talk to you or thank you. So I'll just unmute everyone. 1 minute so that everybody can have a go. Just